Same thing with genes based on chemistry and biology. Can't get much more natural than that. Those are natural things that we're working with. So even if you give a drug to your child or you work with the child's genes, you're working with nature. So there still be children of nature. Well, how about fortune? Basically randomness. That's what Sandel's talking about. Somebody thinks it's just bad, but kind of sitting down and trying to think what capacities your children would have, that's just wrong. Well, if by saying they're children of fortune, if we use kind of the standard method of generating children, what he means is that children aren't influenced by their parents, well, that's clearly wrong, right? Because we're products of our genetic inheritance and our environment. And that's actually one thing that unites all of humanity, kind of underscores the radical contingency of our existence. No one, certainly no one in this room, I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, and no one to my knowledge can choose their parents, their biological parents, right? I mean, we're thrown into this world, we have the biological parents we had, that's it. And their biology influenced who we are to a huge extent. And whoever brought you up, often it's your biological parents, sometimes it's someone else, a guardian or a relative, they shaped your environment. So before we had any choice in the matter, we were already shaped to a large extent by our biological parents and whoever had responsibility for raising us. Because we're the products of our genes and our environment already. So already we're causally influenced to be who we are. Now, if what Sandel is struggling to say is that, well, yeah, but you know, the way things are now, you really can't kind of predict how things are going to turn out. Whereas if you had, you know, some drug that maybe would seems to increase cognitive capacity to a certain extent and seems to be fairly reliable, you have a better chance of producing a child with greater intelligence. If that's what he means, well, you're right, there would be that difference. But is that bad? Is that somehow inherently wrong? If you think about it, the way children are generated now is basically by, it's the kind of equivalent of spinning a roulette wheel while blindfolded, right? I mean, you come up with whatever children are produced at that time based on, you know, the relations you're having at that time, and that's what you get. As opposed to the possibility of maybe influencing your child's makeup, not just by intelligence, but maybe giving them increased resistance to disease, increasing their health in general, making sure they don't have any genetic defects. Is that so bad? I mean, think, for example, of what we've learned about the influence of, can I hold off the question until I finish? I will address all questions. The influence of things that mothers do, you know, while they're pregnant. You know, back in the 40s and 50s, women would smoke, would drink, et cetera, Didn't think that much about it because they didn't realize the effect it could have on the fetus. Well, nowadays, you know, we look very askance at someone who's pregnant, who drinks a lot, who smokes, because we know it can have very serious health effects on the fetus. So in fact, we've taken that knowledge and decided, well, gee, you shouldn't do those things because that will influence what type of child you're going to have. And we think it's a good thing if, in fact, pregnant women show a certain amount of concern about the fetus and decide, well, gee, I can't do this or have to do that to improve the health of the fetus. So we think it's a good thing to improve the health, the intelligence of the fetus. It's just that if we have these drugs, we'll have a better chance of maybe having some sense of what capacity the child may have. And I have to say, by the way, I mean, a lot of people predicted that, oh, gee, we'll be able to, again, the designer baby thing. Frankly, I'm not sure we'll ever get to that stage, certainly not in the foreseeable future, because the technology really just isn't there yet. Pharmacological agents are much further along in terms of being able to be available and marketed. Genetic engineering, it's very difficult to see how that's going to happen within certainly our lifetimes or lifetime of our children or grandchildren, because it's a very difficult process. First of all, I mean, the idea that, I mean, there's no like one gene tied to intelligence, which itself is a very broad concept. If you talk about intelligence, you talk about a whole range of factors, and maybe you'll find out certain genes are associated with, say, visual acuity or memory, things like that. But that just be the first step, because then you have to figure out, if you manipulate that gene, how are other genes going to be affected? Because anyone who knows anything about biology knows that the genome is very complex. We have a lot of so-called inactive genes, junk genes, but they turn out actually not to be junk genes. They turn out to be regulators, and if we work with one gene, it may turn on another gene, and anyway, it's very complicated. So the idea that somehow we'll be able to genetically design children, I think, if we can do that, it's something that's very far off. But in any event, if we could, I don't see why that's necessarily bad. Okay. Then we come to the argument, so we go to the next slide, that, okay, fine, now I've talked about, there's nothing really inherently wrong with enhancements, but people say, well, yeah, but we need to weigh, this goes to one of your concerns, need to weigh the personal benefit to individuals against the possible harm to society. Now, I'm going to assume, by the way, that's, as I point out in the book, obviously we won't have enhancements available until they're proven to be safe. Safe in the sense that, at least in terms of their foreseeable effects, they're not going to harm people, turn them into, ruin their intelligence or what have you. But, people are concerned about, well, gee, it could cause social disruption, it's going to change society a lot. And that's just kind of a bad thing. We don't want to have all this confusion. We want to keep things the way they are. We really can't predict how it's going to change society. And if that's the case, the benefit to the individual should be outweighed by the potential risk to society. Well, remember, I said one thing we have to do is look at our framing assumptions. And one mistake constantly made by those opposed to enhancements is they all say, we balance the improvement to the individual against the risk to society. Why frame the question that way? Why do we think enhancements will only improve the individual who takes the enhancement? Because in fact, enhancements could improve our society in general. And furthermore, based on human history, it seems that we can actually deal with enhancements that cause a huge amount of social change and deal with them in a pretty reasonable fashion, can accommodate them, and they actually turn out to improve our society. A few decades ago, there was an enhancement developed that had dramatic effects on our society. In fact, I think, as I said, literacy was the biggest enhancement we ever had. So I'm not sure it compares with that, but it's something that changed the social structure of all the countries where this became available. And I think it changed it for the better. And it did lead to a huge change in social relationships. But again, I think it changed it for the better. And there were some people when this enhancement came out that said, oh, again, this is unnatural, you're playing God, how can this be done? It's going to lead to all these horrible, sets of immoral conduct or what have you. Well, you probably guessed by now what I'm talking about. If you could hit the next button. Oral contraceptives, right? Came about in the late 50s, early 60s, and there were a lot of people at the time that said, oh, I just can't do this is bad, and there are still some people opposed to it. And it had a tremendous effect on our society, especially increasing the opportunities for women. I mean, if you look at, physicians' offices, courtrooms, corporate boardrooms in the 1940s and 50s and compare them with what they are nowadays, you see a huge difference. Difference being that now there are a lot more women in these professional positions, running companies, what have you, that didn't have those opportunities before. Why didn't they have those opportunities? Well, part of it was sex discrimination, right? But, part of that sex discrimination was tied into the fact that, if you're an employer, why hire someone that, may become pregnant and leave your workforce in a couple of years? Women didn't have a reliable means of controlling their reproduction. Nowadays they do. And it's had a tremendous effect on opportunities for women. Has it had far-reaching consequences? Yeah, it had far-reaching consequences. Women entered the workforce. It caused a certain amount of disruption.